Alright, so welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a pretty fascinating historical journey together. We are going to trace the entire evolution of Christian cooperatives. And we're talking about going all the way from ancient, biblical practices of radical sharing right up to the massive, highly structured, billion-dollar economic engines that are operating in the world today. It's like watching a tiny seed grow into a massive forest. So let's jump right into this incredible timeline. But first, it really begs the question, right? How exactly did an ancient model of biblical sharing transform into a modern billion-dollar financial framework? Because over the course of 2,000 years, what we're really looking at here is a profound, fundamental shift from economic isolation to powerful, community-driven support. And we're going to uncover exactly how that happened. So here's a quick look at our roadmap. We'll start with the roots of radical sharing, see how that evolved into monks and mutual aid, explore the first credit unions, dive into a massive case study with the Philippine cooperative movement, and wrap things up with the modern Joseph ministry. Let's start right at the beginning. Section 1. Roots of Radical Sharing, the Biblical Foundations. It all begins at the very root with the actual communities surrounding Jesus. The foundational concept back then was super simple, but absolutely revolutionary for its time. Supporters provided for his ministry out of their means. And following his death, the early disciples took this to a whole new level. They established this model of radical sharing known as a community of goods. They literally sold off their property and possessions just to ensure that absolutely no one in their community had to live in poverty. It's an amazing illustration of their priorities. They even appointed 7 men of good repute specifically to handle the day-to-day business of the church, just so the apostles could stay entirely focused on prayer. And early church leaders carefully documented this massive cultural shift. Justin Martyr noted a total transformation in what people valued. He wrote that people who used to treasure their private wealth willingly abandoned that entire mindset so they could create a common treasury for anyone who was in need. And that mindset only gathered momentum over time. Another early church father, Tertullian, made a really direct connection between spiritual unity and physical resources. His take was that because these early believers were so completely unified in mind and soul, sharing earthly goods wasn't some forced obligation. It was just this natural hesitation-free reflex born out of their really deep community bond. Now, what's really interesting is Clement of Alexandria's slightly more nuanced take on all this. For him, it wasn't necessarily about stripping everyone of their right to own anything at all. He counseled that private ownership was totally permitted, but, and this is a big but, the ultimate overarching goal was that property had to be used for the good of the community. The focus was always on collective well-being rather than just individual hoarding. We can kind of wrap up these ancient foundations with a really clear, uncompromising instruction from the Didache, which is an early Christian treatise. It says, "Do not turn away from those in want, but make your brothers partakers in all things." So the absolutely crucial takeaway from our first section is that the bedrock of Christian cooperativism was the total eradication of isolation through this kind of radical, selfless sharing. Okay, moving on to section 2, monks and mutual aid, pre-modern intentional communities. As we move through history, something major shifts. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, a lot of spiritual folks decided they needed to form intentional Christian communities as a prophetic demonstration of godliness. We see the Desert Fathers doing this, and later, monasteries and convents really became the torchbearers for this communal lifestyle. Fast forward a bit to the 450s in Britain, and we've got the Celtic churches forming these highly community-based monasteries called muintir, which literally just translates to people. Jumping ahead again to the 14th century, groups like the Brethren of a Common Life in Holland were still rigorously keeping this tradition alive, sharing absolutely all things in common. Well, over time, this really intense communal living evolved into more practical support networks among everyday lay believers. The Mennonites, for example, developed a system they traditionally called mutual aid. Think of this as a form of brotherhood economics. And what made it so unique was its character. It was driven entirely by spontaneous and informal religious motivation. So it wasn't a strict, cold institutional bank. It was just neighbors helping neighbors out of a shared faith. Which brings us to section 3, the first credit unions, faith meets industrial crisis. So during the missionary era, leaders started to realize that just preaching wasn't quite enough anymore. They actually had to solve some really severe economic challenges on the ground. Look at these two examples for a second. William Carey, while he was in India, introduced massive community development concepts. We're talking savings banks and agro-horticultural societies. Meanwhile, the Moravian mission was operated on a full-blown industrial scale. They ran 50 different kinds of global businesses. They even had their own mission ships to support the worldwide work. So they were heavily blending their faith with some very serious economic infrastructure. Let's just compare where we started to where we're heading now. We started with the early church's community of goods. That was total asset sharing based on radical communal living. But as we move into the era of the Mennonites and these early credit unions, the model shifts heavily towards structured financial support. So the goal is no longer just living together on a commune. It's about providing strategic credit access to solve very specific economic crises, all while staying totally rooted in those original biblical values of community care. And the absolute pioneer of this formalization was a Christian believer named Friedrich Wilhelm Reifeson. He was motivated by his faith during a brutally severe economic crisis in Germany. But he didn't just hand out money, he actually founded a society for grain and bread supply, alongside communal bakeries, to provide credit to farmers who were struggling to survive. His model was so incredibly successful that it became the global template for rural cooperative self-help. Now let's look at how this scales up in Section 4, the Philippine Cooperative Movement, Scaling Locally. The history of church-based cooperatives in the Philippines is just a phenomenal case study to look at. It kicked off back in August 1938 in Vigan under the leadership of Reverend Alan R. Huber. Huber was super proactive. Between 1937 and 1941, he personally trained 50 Filipinos to go out and start credit cooperatives. And the results were pretty much immediate. The Batac Christian Credit Union quickly ballooned to 590 members. And right before World War II hit, total membership across these church-based cooperatives had reached around 2,000 people. But the post-war expansion, that is where this model truly exploded. What started as small staff-led groups completely transformed into massive economic drivers. For instance, the Solomon University Community Cooperative was founded in 1962 by teachers and staff to promote economic growth. Fast forward a bit to modern institutions like the Center for Community Transformation, or CCT, and we are literally talking about organizations that have grown into absolute billionaire federations of credit cooperatives. All right, that brings us to our final section, Section 5, the Modern Joseph Ministry, the Future Vision. Today, a lot of modern Christian cooperatives view their incredible work through a specific lens they call a Joseph ministry. This is a direct reference to the biblical story of Joseph, the guy who wisely handled and stored up resources to provide for the community's needs during a massive crisis. Today's cooperatives see themselves doing the exact same thing. They're acting as an antidote to both physical and spiritual poverty by actively moving people from isolation into resilient, highly supportive communities. So, practically speaking, there are three main structural pillars that uphold global Christian cooperatives today. First up, we've got missionary support. This is practically caring for pastors through things like benefits, health insurance, and retirement plans. Second is community services. This is the institutional care side of things, funding Christian hospitals, schools, cemeteries, and housing organizations like Habitat for Humanity. And finally, the third pillar is economic empowerment. This is all about building up financial equity for everyday members through low-interest loans and taking the annual surplus income and distributing it directly back to the members. It's a genuinely brilliant, comprehensive system of care. So we've traced this whole thing from the early disciples selling their possessions all the way to billion-dollar credit union federations operating today. But you know what? The core principle has never changed. We are absolutely better together. So here's a big question for you. How can you apply these ancient principles of community and resource sharing in your own modern and, let's be honest, sometimes isolated worlds? What does your Joseph ministry look like? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me in this explainer, and I really hope this sparks some great ideas for how you can go out and build community today.